Hey everyone, Ewan from What Culture Comics here with a potentially meandering and messy editorial on comics, but it's something I've wanted to get off my chest for a while now. If you're reading comics in 2019, chances are you've heard the old spiel about comics being nowhere near as good as they used to be back in the day. While yes, it's true that the medium itself is nowhere near as popular as it once was, discounting cinematic franchises and video game series of course, it could be argued that we're in a new golden age. New creative partnerships are being forged, there's quality no matter where you look, and generally it's just a great time to be a comic book fan. But that doesn't mean everything's so rosy. At times it can feel as though there's an imperceptible force working to stifle genuine change, an atmosphere of inertia that precludes certain figures from ever developing or changing too radically, lest they stray too far away from the mainstream. Now, to be clear, this is a recent phenomenon. There was a time where seismic change in character progression weren't reset with an easy retcon or creative shakeup. Developments were lasting, and they informed future storylines. Sliding timelines were present, yes, but there was at least the illusion of linear progression. Peter Parker grew old, graduated from college, and married his girlfriend Mary Jane. Batman expanded his family almost every other year. They were always moving forward. Today, one gets the sense that publishers are less keen on messing with the established order. Spider-Man's gone from being a married adult to an eligible bachelor in order to preserve the life of his elderly aunt. The Dark Knight found his most radical enterprise yet, Batman Incorporated, cut short thanks to a line-wide reboot, and most impactful changes are only a convenient retcon away from being forgotten about completely. As a result, readers have looked to Elseworld stories and other adaptations to take the risks that mainstream comics ostensibly can't, at least when it comes to Marvel and DC. Often, it seems as though creators succeed despite the barriers that are seemingly put up in front of them, and while genuine change can and does happen, does anyone ever really believe it will last forever? This is the frustrating reality of modern-day comics. There's a general lack of permanence, engendered by a revolving door of deaths and revivals, retcons, and the occasional effort from publishers to line up the source material with what's popular on the big screen. It's not pervasive across every title or company, but it's a worrying trend that encourages editors to hit the reset button, take stock, and go with what people are familiar with. So, where do we begin? Well, let's focus on Marvel specifically. What we know to be the Marvel Universe today was primarily built during the 1960s, courtesy of visionaries like Jack Kirby, Stan Lee, Steve Ditko, and others. They didn't have to worry about continuity so much at first. All they had was a shared universe, and in carving out an identity and world for each character, it's doubtful anyone at the time ever worried about the prospect of sliding timelines. Take Spider-Man, for instance. Introduced in Amazing Fantasy number 15 in 1962 by Lee and Ditko, Peter Parker was a scrawny 15-year-old high school student. Issue 28 of The Amazing Spider-Man even showed the character graduating on his way to attending Empire State University. He was clearly growing older, and it was a trajectory that eventually led to him continuing his studies as a postgraduate. Years later, after flirting with the reset button with the Clone Saga, Peter even took up teaching as an adult. The world around Peter Parker never stopped changing. Gwen Stacy was killed by Norman Osborn, never to return, and for a while it seemed as though Norman would stay dead forever too. By the time the Green Goblin came back around, it was his son Harry who was revealed to be the latest version of the character. There wasn't a resurrection in sight. Eventually, Peter even married Mary Jane Watson. It was certifiable proof that the character was getting older, growing up, and adapting to a changing world. There wasn't any concern that the character would lose his appeal to younger readers, or that there was an overall lack of familiarity with the comic. Peter was just allowed to grow up and develop like any other literary figure. Now, in modern Marvel's defense, these older works never had to worry about Spider-Man's on-screen influence, or the worry that readers discovering the character through a TV series or film would be confused about why the character was different in the comic at a given point. But I think it's also fair to say that maybe there's been a tendency to underestimate readers too. Fans know the difference between the films and the comics, and that Spider-Man has grown over the years. There's no reason why the source material should be any less ambitious as a result, or even that a sliding timeline where characters age sporadically should necessitate the periodic assumption of the status quo. The point is that, for a long time, comics weren't concerned with characters ever straying too far from their established roots. There was no mandate for Spidey to be single, or for DC's characters to never get married out of the fear of making them any less relatable. They just grew, for a while at least. While there will almost certainly be examples from before of either Marvel or DC getting cold feet and wanting to revert a given character back to their perceived norm, the trend becomes impossible to ignore in the 90s. Many readers consider the decade something of a dark period for the comics industry, and for good reason. While it wasn't without its moments, Nightfall and Jim Lee's X-Men come to mind, the decade also saw the speculator boom and bust bring Marvel to bankruptcy in 1996, which eventually led the company to sell the movie rights to their major properties, namely Spider-Man, the X-Men, and the Fantastic Four. On the page, Marvel were also experiencing great difficulties with their flagship hero. Spider-Man was in the midst of a clone saga, a series that started out with an interesting enough premise but slowly began to drag on across the Wallcrawler's various comics. The basic principle of the comic span off from a storyline in the 1970s, where Miles Warren, the Jackal, had cloned Peter Parker. Marvel decided it would be a great idea to bring the clone back, which led to the blonde-haired denim hoodie-wearing Ben Reilly becoming an integral part of Spidey's cast. The arc would fade into a convoluted mess over the course of 2 years, but it's a fantastic example when it comes to understanding the origins and quandaries of Marvel's quintessentially modern problem. By this point in time, Peter Parker had been through it all. He'd married Mary Jane, bombed with an alien costume, fought Venom, and there was now the prospect of a child coming too. This new struggle arrived at a time when the character was about to embark on another shift in direction, but it seemed as though it was one Marvel were too afraid to follow through. Initially, Ben Reilly was brought back as a means of replacing Peter Parker as Spider-Man. Peter and MJ would have their child and move away from New York to live their lives in peace, after it was revealed that Peter was the real clone all along. Ben, meanwhile, would stay in NYC with a new supporting cast, harkening back to the character's early days as a young bachelor. Mark Bagley designed a new costume, a great look by the way, and for a while it seemed as though Ben really would be the new Spider-Man. But Marvel were also caught between two minds. They wanted to replace Peter out of the fear he wasn't relatable anymore, while at the same time introducing a shakeup that arguably would have been twice as seismic as anything they could have done with the baby. Peter could have happily been Spider-Man, stayed married to MJ, and had a child, but editorial were convinced they'd lose touch with readers. By the time they came to committing to that change, however, they chickened out again, bringing Norman Osborn back from the dead after 20 years, faking a miscarriage for MJ and Peter's child, and killing Ben off, thus revealing Peter to have been the real version all along. Both were fatal mistakes, and it was this exact kind of tinkering that laid the groundwork for further disastrous retcons in the years following. If you'd only been reading Spider-Man for the last 10 or so years and had no knowledge of Peter Parker's life beforehand, you'd probably find talk of him having a wife and nearly a child kind of bonkers. How so? Well, in 2007, Marvel decided that Spider-Man had deviated too much from his most recognizable self. The Ultimate Comics, which had been focusing on a younger Peter in a new canon, were outperforming the publisher's mainstream offerings both critically and in terms of popularity, and so editorial resolved to bring the mainstream Peter more in line with how he used to be, young, single, and without the ostensible burden posed by 40 years of continuity. The resulting story was One More Day, a comic that endeavored to restore Peter's secret identity after Civil War, break up his marriage with Mary Jane, and make him more relatable to their readership. The motivating factor behind this change? The elderly Aunt May is moved closer to death's door by an assassin's bullet, and so Pete decides to make a deal with Mephisto to save her life, at the cost of his marriage, his future, and the aforementioned fallout from Civil War. In plenty of ways, One More Day exemplifies modern comics' obsession with the status quo. Aunt May could have been killed off, and briefly was, at any point in the previous few decades, but Marvel convinced themselves that she was now an immovable aspect of Spidey's comics, a status seemingly reiterated by the character's various forays into mainstream media. And from then on in, it was rinse and repeat for Marvel in terms of reversing some of the more seismic changes in the company's recent history. Steve Rogers was resurrected in 2009, and would move in and out of the Captain America identity sporadically over the course of the next decade, and even one of the most lauded shifts of the modern age found itself put out to pasture in 2015, when all-new, all-different Daredevil put Matt Murdock's identity back in the bottle, thereby pegging his relationship with the public and his allies back about a decade as a result. This wasn't just a problem exclusive to the House of Ideas, however. DC found themselves heading backwards the same decade as well, partially out of nostalgia for the Silver Age of comics, as figures like Barry Allen and Hal Jordan returned to out the then present-day Flash and Green Lantern respectively, Wally West and Kyle Rayner. Even the New 52, a 2011 reboot designed to divest from the established continuity, managed to set DC back years by erasing decades of character development, all to make their characters more modern, and in the process, way less interesting. The New 52 committed a whole host of offenses, particularly when it came to Batman. Barbara Gordon regained the ability to walk after spending years as Oracle, one of DC's few heroes with a disability, while the Dark Knight himself saw his most expressive and transformative period in years fudged by the publisher's desire to essentially bring the character back to basics. Corrective measures have been taken in the years since, with DC Rebirth striving to regain the tonal uniqueness of DC's old continuity, but even then the spectre of the status quo lingers, particularly when it comes to Batman. Writer Tom King found himself pushing the character in a new direction when it came to his romance with Catwoman, and while King is set to conclude his story next year, it won't be on the main Batman comic. Now, judging from reports, it seems as though editorial got cold feet regarding any prospective changes that could have been made, and it's predictably disappointing. So, where am I going with all of this? Well, prior to the release of House of X, writer Jonathan Hickman chimed in with his own piece of wisdom regarding the comics medium's tendency to try and sync their efforts up with Hollywood in an interview with Entertainment Weekly. While it's not the only reason why superhero books are so afraid of genuinely seismic change these days, bar the X-Men, who are something of an anomaly, it's certainly a big one. Speaking to EW, Hickman said the following: "I think one of the big mistakes that some people make at Marvel Comics is that we are reactive to what they're doing in the Marvel films. We should not be taking our creative cues from the direction they're taking things in the movies. That kind of defeats the point. My argument has been that I should always be way out in front of that stuff. All that stuff is being drawn from source material." Hickman's point is kind of obvious. Too often, Marvel and DC have endeavored to make sure their comics match up with whatever's transpiring on screen. The year Infinity War premiered in theaters also saw the introduction of a whole new event about the Infinity Gems called Infinity Wars. Legacy heroes are chopped and changed to accommodate on-screen trends all the time, and it's not too infrequent to see characters altered to more closely resemble their on-screen counterparts, either visually or even personality-wise. The main issue currently is that comics are meant to be the vanguard of superhero pop culture, and yet they're too often afraid to take the bold steps they were famous for during their formative moments. That may yet change, but when the most mature and, dare I say it, exciting depiction of Spider-Man over the last decade comes in a video game, one that was brave enough to depict the character as an adult with changing relationships and responsibilities, something is evidently not right. There's of course Spider-Verse as well, but the common theme between both interpretations is that they spotlighted a version of Peter that had grown, he'd matured, and was different. But to conclude this random stream of consciousness, I'm going to leave you all with 3 questions. Has the sheer expanse of these mythologies prohibited more lasting change? Is it the increasing dominance of big screen superhero fiction? Or is it just the case that there's a genuine anxiety that comic book characters can't survive past their most recognizable incarnations? Whatever the cause, comics cannot afford to stand still. They never used to, and they certainly shouldn't now.